In this video, I'm going to show some examples of estimating differences of fractions by rounding to 0, a half, or a whole. On question 1, the problem is 2/9 minus 1/8, and we're going to estimate before we subtract. So anytime I'm doing estimation, I like to think of a number line. And in my number line, I'm going to go ahead and divide it in half. And I'm going to have over here, I'm going to have 0. In this case, it'll be 0/9. And over here, I'll have a whole, which will be 9/9. And halfway would be half of 9/9, which would be 4.5/9. I'm then going to place my 2/9 on this number line, which would be approximately right here, 2/9. It's only 2/9 away from 0, but it's 2.5/9 away from 1/2. So when I'm rounding 2/9 to 0, a half, or a whole, it's going to be closer to 0/9 to 0 than it is to a half. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just put a 0 right here. I'm going to then do the same thing with 1/8. And after you do these just a little bit, you'll be able to do them in your head without drawing a number line. But for these problems, I'm going to go ahead and draw a number line out. So half of 8/8 would be 4/8, and 1/8 would be way over here. It would only be 1/8 away from 0, and it would be 3/8 away from a half. So therefore, it would be closer to 0, so we'd round it to 0 as well. So now our problem is 0 minus 0, which is 0. Question 2, you probably could even look at this one without drawing any number lines because 1/7 is very close to 0 and 1/9 is also very close to 0, so 0 minus 0 is 0. On question 3, I am going to draw number lines out. It says 7/9 minus 7/12. So here's my number line for ninths. Here's the 0 line. Here's the 1 whole line. And just as I did before, half of 9 is 4.5. So 7 is going to be somewhere right about here, 7/9. And 7/9 is 2.5/9 away from 4.5/9 from a half. And it's only 2/9 away from a whole. So when I'm rounding it, it's going to round up to a whole. So I'm going to put a 1 whole right over the 7/9. Going to do the same thing with 7/12. Here's 0/12, here's 12/12, and here's half, 6/12. 7/12 is going to be somewhere right about here. It is 1/12 away from a half, and it is 5/12 away from 1 whole. So when we're rounding it, it's going to go back to a half. So I'm going to write a half right on top of this. And 1 minus 1/2 is 1/2. On question number 4, we just estimated 7/12 and we rounded it to a half, so I'm going to go ahead and just change this to a half. But I am going to draw a number line for 1/3. So here's 0/3, here's 3/3. Half of 3/3 is 1.5/3. 1/3 is going to be right about here. And that's a half of a third away from a half. And it is 1/3 away from 0. So if we're going to round this, it's going to round up to a half. So I'm going to change this to 1/2, and 1/2 minus 1/2 is 0.